you can almost think of Ash as the highest code, low code framework that exists. Right?
Okay. Welcome to a special edition of Software Sophistication. Today we have Zach Daniel, the creator of the Ash framework, with us to show us how to integrate Phoenix LiveView and the Ash framework. Zach, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the Ash framework?
Yeah, so my name is Zach Daniel, as was already explained. I'm the author of Ash Framework. It's an application development framework for Elixir. So it's a general purpose framework. It's not necessarily focused on web development or back-end development. You can kind of use it for anything, and often you'll use it with Phoenix and with Phoenix LiveView. And in fact, that's the sort of recommended setup. So I work at a company called Alembic. They employ me and allow me to work on Ash, mostly full time. I also do client work. But they've been pushing, lots of great stuff recently. Ash authentication was just dropped, right? So Alembic has really been pushing the envelope here and making this project possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Zach. And I just want to say I've been in the Ash Discord for about 2 weeks. And if you are thinking about using Ash, Zach is very accessible in there. He's answering questions all times of day and night. So you can literally get feedback and help from the guy that wrote the darn thing. So join the Ash Discord if you are interested in getting some help for Ash. The reason why we're doing this collaboration is because Shannon asked a question on the LiveView Mastery YouTube channel, which was, quote, "One thing I'm still trying to figure out is how Phoenix plays with the Ash framework. Apparently they go together really well, but there's basically zero documentation or examples of how to look them up nicely. If you want an idea for another video, that'd be something I know I'd appreciate." And then Zach jumped into the comments himself. And I saw the name. I said, Zach Daniel. Wait a second. Is that the guy himself? And so then I responded to Zach and I said, hey, Zach, you want to do a video? Zach responds, yeah, I want to do a video. And so here we are. Zach, Jose Valim, the creator of Elixir, himself called out the Ash framework in this Hacker News comment saying, and I quote, "So I'd say Phoenix strikes the right balance here, and if you have a highly formulaic application, projects like Ash may be to your taste." Zach, what is your take on the creator of Elixir calling you out?
Well, I think this is one of the most interesting things about Ash and when working on Ash for the past few years is it looks like a lot of things. On the surface, it looks like a lot of things that were a bad idea, were sort of categorically a bad idea. And there's a lot of people in the Elixir community. It's characterized by people who have been burned in other ecosystems and other libraries and other tools, or even just people who have grown beyond, a set of tools that they felt was overly magic, difficult to change, difficult to understand. And they moved to Elixir, I think primarily because it's simple. The concurrency model is simple. The state management is simple. It's all sort of what you see is what you get. And when you look at Ash and you just look at the first example, you look at an example resource that sort of lives in a Postgres database and has an API, it looks, I think, a little bit like those bad ideas that people have run away from, where you're sort of coupling the external face of your application to the state, or there's a lot of design patterns that it kind of does make it easier to do those design patterns if you wanted to. But I think that's the sort of tip of the iceberg. That's the surface level of Ash. And most of the people, everybody that I've experienced who have used Ash, they've used it for a while, and the various layers and the escape hatches and the tools that exist, the way that you compose your application of things like data layers, notifiers, authorizers, right? So in this way, it acts as a sort of skeleton or a backbone for the structure of your application, allowing you to expose that application with a live view or an API or whatever, right? You define the application in its own sort of, that's Ash's job, is defining your application, not necessarily the sort of UI of it or the APIs. Well, it will define APIs, but we'll get there. So I think once you see that it's more than just the sort of example of we have a post and a tweet and we create the post and that's how that works, right? And it's in fact much more complicated. Complicated maybe is a bad word, but much more expressive. You have a lot more tools at your disposal. I think that's when you sort of start to see what it is. So there's been a lot of misconceptions about Ash, and it doesn't upset me when people have those misconceptions, but it has been the sort of biggest challenge that we've faced is how do we present Ash in a way that it doesn't sort of get judged by the code examples on the cover that are designed for simplicity, right? Not for showing you all of the raw power under the hood. So yeah, it's been an interesting road, and I think I've seen this time and time again where people think, Ash is made for, simple apps that, and I wouldn't want to use it if I was going to write something super custom, right? But then people end up using Ash and it goes the other way, right? They find themselves feeling limited by the ways that they were building applications before, and not wanting to ever build applications in the future in Elixir without using Ash. And that's been my experience, and many people have said that to me. Like they've referred to it as a mind virus, where once you start building things with Ash, you can't imagine building it any other way.
Excellent. All right, well, on the outside looking in, the claim that we're making here by mirroring LiveView and Ash, so essentially we have to learn 3 frameworks. We have to learn Phoenix, we have to learn Phoenix LiveView, we have to sit that on top of Ash, and so this is a lot to ask. And so Zach Daniel, creator of Ash, what is the payoff? We're using Ash, we're using 3 frameworks effectively. What is the payoff to using something like Ash?
There's a lot of answers to this question. I'm going to do my best here, but as people have explained to me, right, it's difficult. I'm the creator of this thing. I'm so embedded in it, and it can be really difficult for me to verbalize the things that I know in a way that reaches new users. And in a lot of cases, you'll find, there's been YouTube videos put out by other people who do a better job explaining what Ash is than I've done in any of the YouTube videos I've made, right? So I think, my expertise lies a little bit, lies in the technology, not necessarily the explaining to a beginner or a newcomer exactly like why you should use this. That doesn't mean I can't do my best though. So I would say to somebody transitioning, or to somebody who's familiar with Phoenix already, and I think we're going to talk about it from that perspective, right? But somebody familiar with Phoenix already will have encountered a whole host of issues that Ash was kind of designed to help with, right? We because Phoenix was the web tool, and still is as we're building Ash, right? So one of the biggest issues is Phoenix, and this is, you can ask Chris McCord about this, right? Phoenix does not have really rigid opinions about how you structure your application, right? It's just modules and functions. And when they generate a context for you, it's just a module with some functions, right? And there's a lot of conveniences with building in Ecto and into how you might want to do things, but the Phoenix framework itself doesn't really care, right? It's a web framework, and it wants to let you build your internal application however you want. And that is really nice. It's nice to give people that freedom. But at the same time, what happens, and I've seen this time and time again in Phoenix applications, is you end up rebuilding tons of the concepts of your app into various layers of your application, right? And so you have, so let's say, your classic example of a post, like what are the fields of a post is embedded in, especially if you're doing API stuff, it's in a GraphQL type that you've defined. It's in a GraphQL resolver that you've defined. It's in the context function that gets the stuff out and, might need to transform it in some way. And then it's in the Ecto schema. And then it's also in your database, right? And you have all of these layers that you're effectively like hand crafting, and that's a dangerous thing, right? That's a difficult thing that will lead to errors down the road, because what it means is you have to go hunting for anything you might potentially need to change to react to some core concept changing. However, on the flip side of that, there's a pro to that. It's very flexible. If you need to change one small thing in one little layer, you don't need to go and change, the way that some other layer looks, right? So there's a reason behind that. And I think, it should be acknowledged that there's a reason why Elixir in general kind of pushes people towards it, or at least why most Elixir and Phoenix applications start looking that way. Ash takes our sort of fundamental difference between between that pattern and Ash is, in Ash, you define your domain, right? So you define like domain concepts, right? So when you have like a post, you can map that post to a database table if you want, but it's a convenience. It's not necessarily like, Ash isn't meant to just map directly to data only. It's meant to allow you to define the sort of concepts of your domain in a sort of best fit pattern, right? Like what are the entities, right? Sometimes it's not a perfect world, and you got to make things that, you got to surface complexity into your domain. But what we believe is that you should model that domain, and you should derive the rest of your application from the model. And instead of handwriting every other piece in your system to map it to your underlying model, you should derive it. And that's the underlying thing. And I think it'll be a little bit more clear as we go over some examples of exactly what that means. But in Ash, when you want to add a GraphQL, you don't go into your absinthe schema, write a query, write a type, and instead you use the GraphQL extension, and you say, put this action into the GraphQL schema. And it will look at the actions. The actions are a very critical piece, right? Ash is more about the verbs than the nouns, right? So it'll look at the actions. It'll say like, what are the arguments that it has? What additional metadata does it provide? All that sort of stuff. And it will construct a GraphQL type for it, and a resolver and a query, and it has a data loader all under the hood, right? And so that pattern is sort of everywhere, where the goal is to define your model. Your resource is what we call them, is to define that domain and then use tools and extensions. You can build your own extensions. It's quite easy. So use those tools and extensions to project that domain into new things. So if you want a JSON API, you do it the same way. There's a migration generator, right? So instead of having to hand write migrations and then like maybe get them wrong, like they're subtly different from what you declared in your schema, you instead derive what the migration should be from the resource, because the resource is the source of truth. So that is the sort of fundamental difference. And I guess in a way I didn't really explain the benefits. I think I'm going to take a few more minutes here to talk about why this matters, especially in the context of LiveView. One of the things that makes LiveView so amazing, especially for people that are just starting up a project, is it's sort of like a cost that a lot of companies have internalized, not realizing it up until recently, or until you try LiveView, is how expensive it is to build APIs and to build an entire separate front end, expensive in time and energy, right, from your engineers, which in turn it becomes money, right? So and there's so much error there. There's so many things that could go wrong, and there's so many moving pieces that you have to figure out. With LiveView, you can build an application without building that API. You don't have to face that cost. You don't have to deal with that problem. But then you have a flip side, right? Which is 6 months down the road, a year down the road, somebody asks, hey, we have an integration partner now. They need to get all this data out of our system, and we want people to be able to connect their accounts. And you realize that it was a really good short-term choice to not build an API, but in the long run, you're missing a bunch of critical pieces of infrastructure that you need. You have to go, and now you're up. You're going to go handwrite a bunch of things, and maybe they'll call into your context function. So maybe you get some reuse, but not much. And that's a huge problem. I think it's the tail end issue of LiveView. It's a good problem to have. It's like, okay, look, I didn't have to make that before, so I can wait until I do have to make it, right? But people that are using Ash don't hit that wall, because Ash, it encourages you to define your model well structured, and it exposes an Elixir API. It gives you tools to write code against those models so you can use it from your LiveView. And then later, when you need to add an API, it's like 3 lines of code to add a resource and an action into your GraphQL API, and they all go through the same logic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe when you look at some example code later. But if you have like a specific action that lists things in matching some filter with some special rules about it, and then transforms them in some way, putting that in a GraphQL is just as cheap. It's 3 lines of code as it is to put like a basic get by ID, right? So that is, I think, where people who are familiar with LiveView, that is why they should care about Ash, and that's the main benefit.
Excellent. So you're saying that what you're telling me is that you've created this Shangri-La of frameworks, in the sense that you build this domain layer in Ash, and you can use Ash I can make my GraphQL layer on top. I can make my JSON API layer on top, my who knows, a command line interface on top. I don't know if Ash has support for that yet, but your claim is
Not
that, what's that? You said not yet? Okay, but it's coming at some point.
Not yet, but yeah, I mean, PR is welcome.
Right. Your claim is that you build it in this core Ash layer and you can bolt on the interfaces into the core functionality of your code base by using Ash, which of course Graybeard would say, that sounds good, but what about all the customizations that you have to do in a real production application? What you're talking about, this is ultimately what Jose Valim's argument was, which is, I mean, if it's formulaic, it'll work, but you should probably use Phoenix. So therefore, how when things get rough, when things get custom, how does Ash handle that? Is the claim for real?
It's a great question, and it's the best question, right? It's any engineer worth their salt is going to be asking that question of any tool, right? Like, how much is this going to lock me in? And is there hidden lock-in? Is there, all this sort of stuff, right? And that's what you're looking out for. So what I would say is, you can almost think of Ash as the lowest code, low code framework that exists. Or sorry, the highest code, low code framework that exists. Right?
Okay.
So its job is to give you a set of tools that allow you to do really powerful things without having to write a bunch of code that you're inevitably going to get wrong, and there's going to be bugs, and it's going to be different every time you write it, so they don't plug and play, right? But what's interesting is that there was a choice that I made early on that Ash isn't like it's not a cloud service. It's not it's most, you could almost compare it more to things like, Hasura and these, GraphQL as a service or database as a service type things, where you define using some definition that they provide and it gives you all this extra behavior. But I'm the same person, the same people who've been burned by these technologies in the past. That's me too, right? So there's a reason that this is just, it's a framework in terms of when you call into it, it runs the logic based on these set of patterns, right? But at the same time, it's just a library in your Elixir application. So that's your first escape hatch. That's your highest level escape hatch. It's just like, don't use Ash for the thing that's really crazy. If there's a thing that doesn't fit well, it doesn't have to, right? You can write a Phoenix controller. You can write an ecto schema. You can do any of the other things you already could do. Just don't use Ash for that. That's your highest level escape hatch.
Okay.
But we also there's a reason, that's not ideal. Because Ash resources are really nice. Once you start using them, you're going to want to be able to fit everything into a resource, because if you do, a bunch of tools come with it for free, right? Even if you have to get creative with the way that your actions work or the way that they're implemented, there are long-term benefits to doing that. So Ash is stacked with escape hatches, and to the point that I don't even if I'd call them escape hatches, because they're there by design, because the goal is to let you implement whatever thing it is that you need to implement, right? So the sort of the lower escape hatch from that, just don't use Ash for that thing, right, is you can have manual actions. Manual actions are about as simple as it gets. They follow the calling structure of a regular action, right? So they take the attributes and the arguments or whatever, but then you just call to an Elixir function and do whatever you want, and as long as you return the right thing. So you do have to do some sort of extra stuff there. You got to return the what the action expects you to return, right? But I mean, that's a callback. That's what those look like, right? Then you can do anything you want, right? And it doesn't have to be constrained by what Ash will do, or what Ash sort of supports out of the box. And then even further than that, you can add, if you just need to add custom behavior. Most of your custom behavior will be not done sort of declaratively with Ash magic. You're going to add what's called a change to your action, and a change is like a plug, right? Where you get the change set, you return the change set, and so in that you you do your custom work, and that's also just an Elixir function, right? So there's tons of escape hatches. Even going so far as to writing a custom data layer, right? Writing a custom data layer is in Ash much simpler. With the exception perhaps of supporting complex filters, that can be quite difficult. But generally speaking, writing a custom data layer is much simpler than writing a ecto repo adapter, right? Because Ash is designed to be compatible with, I would say, more generic sources, right? So we have Ash CSV, we have ETS, we have Amnesia. within like a week of using Ash, one of the people at Alembic created Ash Gen Server, where when you create one, anything that uses that data layer, if you create something, it starts a gen server with the state of the resource. If you update it, updates the gen server with the state of the resource. And if you destroy it, it stops the gen server, right? So data layers can be are much easier to write.
That's really cool.
Yeah, there's a lot that you can do with it, and there's a lot of escape hatches throughout that will help you find some good way to fit it to the pattern. And worst case scenario is only 80-90% of it. Right? Worst case scenario, you get the nice stuff for 80-90%, and then you got to do something crazy, and you just don't use Ash, and you still saved a bunch of time, right? So I think that it's not an all or nothing pattern.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you for that, Zach. Zach, Ash is just coming into prominence. Many people watching this video will not know much about the Ash programming model. Can you break down like the standard approach to build software using the Ash framework, just so that we have a general mindset of the approach, the mindset approach when building things in Ash?
Yeah, so I think the best thing to do is we're going to talk a little bit later about this sort of demo app that we have, but I'm just going to show a little preview of that and kind of show what it looks like in the broad sense. So I'll switch over here, and the way that it works in Ash is right now, if you're building with a Phoenix, if you're building like a web interface or something like that, you're probably just going to put your Ash application into a Phoenix app. It's a lot faster than adding Phoenix to an Ash app because there's not as much code, not as much pieces that involve Ash. So generally, you just make a Phoenix app. And the way that this works is, as you can see here, we have Twitter web. This is a Twitter clone. We have Twitter web and we have Twitter, and Ash pretty much always lives in the, it's not a web thing, right? It's the sort of standard declaration of your model and how it works in the moving pieces. And for anybody wondering why I'm looking up, I have stacked monitors and my monitor is up there. So if that looks funny. What you can see here is we have two APIs. In Phoenix, you might refer to these as contexts, but in Ash, they're APIs. And so you can see this is like a simple, we have twitter.accounts, and it has a registry, and that registry tells us what are all the resources that interact or that are available inside of this API. So those are the two biggest pieces of Ash, is an API and a registry. You always interact with the API, you use the API as what you generally are calling into, but then the resources contain the rules and the logic and all of that. So here you can see like a user, for example.
Zach,
I'll stick with
wait,
similar.
Before you go on, Zach, I understand the API, but what does the registry mean?
Yeah, so the registry is actually more, it's practically an optimization, but the reason that it's even a separate thing. But basically, like an API needs to know what resources are available to use with that API, right? So like that it knows like what resources you can call using this API. The reason it's a registry though is because of compile time dependencies in Elixir, which is if inside of your API, the module that you call all the time, if you had all of the resources listed, there would be compile time dependency issues because every time you call this module, you might need to call, right? So it's kind of more of an optimization, but there is a little bit more. We have extensions for registries. So the registry contains the logic of validating certain things about the resource, like that any related resource that is not explicitly configured to be in a different API is also in this one, right? So there's some validations about sort of the rules of connecting different resources that exist in the registry. So it's kind of a dual purpose thing. Okay. I'll stay away from accounts for now, actually, and I'll just show we've got tweets, right? This is a quite a simple one. We've got a tweets resource here. And what you'll see is all of this stuff is defined in sections kind of related to sort of purpose, right? And the different sections are added. Some of these sections are added by extensions. For example, this is a data layer extension, and that adds the Postgres section down here where you say, here's the table and here's the repo. And this notifier, right, that's a special kind of extension as well, that adds this section, this pub sub section that allows you to configure pub sub events coming from your resource. So before we get into all of that, I think we're gonna keep to the simple pieces, which is basically what you've seen, throughout a lot of things, right? With ecto schemas having fields, right? We have attributes, Attributes are very similar to, to other things, but they do contain a little bit more information. For instance, we have, is it private? As in, should this be editable via some API? Is it sensitive? That also does exist in Elixir. So, but there's a lot of, or in Ecto, I mean, but there's a lot of, interesting options that exist on attributes.
So when you were just,
and then we have relationships.
When you were just scrolling, you actually had, it looked like Ash framework code completion. What is that?
Yeah, so we have there's a custom Elixir Sense extension that ships with Ash, like in the Ash package. So you don't have to like install anything. And there's actually a slight bug in the current release version of Elixir LS. So if you're just using the latest on VS Code, it's not going to work. But whenever they release the next version, it's going to work for everybody. And I'm very excited about that. To make it work for you now, you have to like download Elixir LS yourself and build it. It's a whole pain. But yeah, so we have the way the DSL works, we have, or the way the extension works is we have, at any point, you can get completion for what DSL items are available at that point, as well as documentation for like all of the options and that sort of thing, right? So I can say, and here we're going to get, let's see, we should get completion on the type, but we're not, so we'll just move on. But you get completion on, all of the options and read their documentation. This is kind of even a lot more preferable, I would say, than trying to like go read a very dry DSL specification. It's much better just to sort of discover it as you go through and see like, what are my options? What can I have here?
Yeah, this is phenomenal.
And so yeah, we have relationships. These are pretty classic. The same with like ecto associations. The big difference I would say though is that like they're a little bit higher level, and so you can have a relationship that crosses one API to another. So the Twitter is has an author, but that's in a different API. Now that doesn't come with any runtime performance issues that exist in another API. It's just the rules for how you interact with this might be a little bit different because it's in this other API. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that. And as you can see, we have belongs to, has many, and many to many. And we also have custom. So, you can do all sorts of stuff here where I can say, or set manual. And a manual relationship lets you define the join in a custom way. You could join across 5 tables if you wanted, right? So there's a lot of options with relationships. So those are the little building blocks of the resource, sort of the concept of the resource. But on their own, attributes and relationships don't do anything, right? And that's actually very important. Ash, it looks on the tin like it's about the nouns in your system, right? Like the most important thing in this setup is the tweet. And that is not true. That's actually, it's really convenient when you can sort of make part of your concept a noun, because it'll help with interacting with it in some ways. But Ash is still, it's still functional. It's still immutable, just like any other thing in the Elixir language. And so what really matters for a resource is these actions, right? So actions define what Ash can do, and these are the actually more difficult and more to implement in the first place, and the more interesting aspect of declarative programming is that these are declarative actions. So these aren't functions on their own that you call. Nothing's happening inside of these, but we're building up a set of instructions for the behavior of this action, right? So this one is the tweet feed for an individual user, right? And I take a user ID and I sort by inserted at descending, and I filter for the tweets that are visible to that user ID. So we'll dive a little bit more into this, I think, a little bit later, but I think we're gonna do a feature review. But as you can see, like, these are actually what matter, and we can chain custom behavior like this. We have all sorts of tools available to us to do custom things, and even in some cases to fully escape out of the Ash framework tooling and just say, this is a manual action. I'm going to do what I want. Don't try to do anything special here for me. And then you just sort of get the shell of your action defined, and you do the important bits. So the general programming model looks like that. And then I would say the one other thing is, when you're writing code against these, you will often define a code interface. And a code interface defines functions on, in this case, let's not dive too deep in that. You can kind of decide where the functions get defined, but by default with this setup, they're going to get defined on the resource itself. And so there's going to be like a tweet.feed that takes a user ID and a tweet.get that takes an ID, right? And so you can see, I'll go find a place where we use these. You can see we have, .feed. And that function will call the appropriate action. So this, in a way, you can think of like code usage of your Ash resources as just another API, right? It's just one way your resources might get used. And so you define that API by adding a code interface that allows you to use it in a more conventional Elixir-y way. And you can actually see, like, if I were to go into the feed action in this case, and I were to say, get the feed of tweets for a user. We'll see if this works on the recompile here, but what should happen, see, the description of that action will be, lifted up into the function documentation for the generated function, right? So you get a very conventional, high quality, very flexible Elixir API from your resources. So that's the programming model. And then the point here is you can attach all these other things. You can attach extensions. You can write your own extensions. Ash comes with, in a lot of ways, Ash is a build your own framework tool, because Ash, even all of the stuff in your Ash resource, all of this is just an extension that gets added by default to resource, right? So everything that is defined by Ash core is defined with tools that you have access to define anything you want. And it's very easy. So I'd say that's the other aspect of the program model, is deriving this behavior, but then also building extensions that are idiomatic DSL extensions that can add behavior to your system.
Okay. So what's the difference between the read feed action and the code interface feed? Like, clearly the code interface depends on the read feed, but how are they different, and why did you have to define the code interface?
Yeah, so you don't have to. There's a low-level API that everything uses when they call, like, that kind of underpins everything. So what I could do is I could say, just showing sort of an example here, I could say, I want to do the feed action, and I could build a query, and then I could run that query, right? So, but the thing is, this is kind of like, this is the lowest level version of it. And this is what, like, Ash GraphQL, like, we'll talk, maybe talk a bit about those extensions later, but this is what those all use to construct queries directly against actions in your resource. And this is what the code interface calls under the hood, right? But the problem is that this is not, you want to provide APIs or layers of sort of indirection between the pieces of your application so that you can change those APIs separately from changing the internal implementation, right? And so what that means is, by defining code interface, if I come over here and I'm like, well, actually, I want to do some more, I want to change the way that this works, that you keep the definition of, I lost it here, yeah. You keep the definition of this the same, or even in the worst case scenario, you say, you know what, this isn't doing it for me anymore. I can come in here and I can say, feed and do this myself, right? And you've created that important layer in your system of that API that separates the internals from the externals.
Okay.
But the point here of this is you don't generally need to do that, because we can figure out what it should be based on the action, right? So that's kind of the reason for that separation.
Excellent. Okay. All right. I think that was awesome. So okay. I guess we can talk about the Twitter clone and jump into authentication.
Okay, yeah. Let's take a look.